I mean, if you looked at what they were asking of food systems in Europe, the things they're looking for is for us to reduce the amount of inputs going into our systems, to reduce the impacts of them on the environment, to be more efficient in terms of how we use resources, and to try and upregulate biodiversity in all our systems, in all farming practice. So that kind of provides the policy context, I guess, for why might we relook at the swards we have and the types of swards.
Hello, I'm Stuart Childs and you're welcome to The Dairy Age, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. With fine weather seeing receding taking place in many parts of the country, I spoke with Brendan Horan, Teagasc Dairy Systems researcher, to discuss the rationale for investigating multi-species swards in the multi-milk trial currently running at Curtin's farm, and also to get a feel for what multi-species swards are bringing to the table that has encouraged the Department of Agriculture to incentivise their use in the 2023 multi-species scheme, following on from the 2022 scheme, which saw applications to sow more than 10,000 hectares.
My area of work, Stuart, is farm systems research, which is nearly the last phase of evaluating anything before it's recommended to dairy farmers. So generally the process is we identify big important technologies, such as the type of cow, the stocking rate, for example, the level of supplementation. We implement them in a whole farm system over 3 to 5 years, and we look at the impacts they have within that whole system. So you're measuring 24/7, 365, how much grass is produced, what milk production, what the costs, the economic impacts, and some of the environmental impacts of those technologies are. So I guess if you looked at that system then and go back maybe 3 to 4 years, so pre-pandemic, and I suppose at that stage you were seeing the farm to fork rolled out from Europe, the new ambition for how food is to be produced. I mean, if you looked at what they were asking of food systems in Europe, the things they're looking for is for us to reduce the amount of inputs going into our systems, to reduce the impacts of them on the environment, to be more efficient in terms of how we use resources, and to try and upregulate biodiversity in all our systems, in all farming practice. So that kind of provides the policy context, I guess, for why might we relook at the swards we have and the types of swards. Added to that, then you have to look at, well, where is Ireland in terms of European farming? And I suppose if you were to, we have a grazing system, high welfare status for grazing animals. While the animals across Europe are moving indoors, we've continued our traditional grazing system and all the benefits that's brought in terms of productivity and profitability for family farms as well. But I suppose if you were to look at some of the weaknesses in our system and say, well, where are the weaknesses? One of them would be in terms of our chemical nitrogen use levels. We are, by comparison with other European countries, high users of chemical nitrogen fertilizer. And look, the targets now, both from the Climate Action Plan and from the European Farm to Fork, are that we need to reduce the amount of fertilizers we're using and reduce substantially. And that's already in train in terms of farms, I guess. And the third piece in the jigsaw, so we have the policy framework, we have the requirement to reduce our nitrogen footprint in terms of our systems. The third piece in that jigsaw then is climate change and adaptation. And we're seeing just at the moment now, some farms are very dry. This is probably one of the earliest years we've ever ended up in very dry conditions on some of these very fine free draining soils in the south and east. That's becoming increasingly frequent, that we are limited in terms of moisture. And there's a question there about how do we adapt our systems if we are going to be, as we know, dealing with wetter winters and drier summers going forward. And I suppose, so that's kind of like the context. And the background then is, there's a huge amount of research going on in terms of sward diversity in component work, in field trials and whatnot over the last 10 years. And I'm thinking of the work done in John Finn has done a huge body of work within Teagasc in Johnstown Castle. You've got others, though. UCD have done work in terms of multi-species research, Helen Sheridan, Tommy Boland and others. And that's fantastic work. And I suppose in farm systems, you have to look at all that work that's going on in those kind of component evaluations and say, well, what's coming out of those trials and what potentially should we be integrating in our systems? So the two things then, in 2018, we're re-looking at these systems. Two things that struck out were we're definitely going to have to reduce the amount of chemical nitrogen that we're using. So that's going to be for farmers as well as for research. We have to reduce that level from, it's 180 on average back down. bring that level down. And the second, I suppose, theme was, well, we need to increase the diversity in our grasslands. Is there benefits, not just in terms of clover, primarily in clover, but also in terms of, is there potentially any other benefits, including anything else in our grasslands that might give us added advantage in terms of these challenges and threats going forward? So I guess that's kind of where we've come from. And that then led to the setting up of the project that we're talking about today, which is the Curtin's multi-milk farm systems experiment. So there we're comparing the traditional system of the time, which was a monoculture of ryegrass supported by 250 kilos of chemical N per hectare per year, and comparing that system with two other low nitrogen input systems, one being the classic ryegrass white clover system, high PPI ryegrasses and medium leaf white clovers, and then the third system being the multi-species grassland system, which is an 8-species mix of clovers, grasses, and herbs included in the sward. And that's also on a lower level of chemical nitrogen, 150 kilos per year.
So generally speaking, Brendan, like the work that you were doing prior to that was always kind of the higher end nitrogen application rate stuff, and obviously lysimeters and so forth over on the farm, checking for the responsiveness to nitrogen and the amount of it leaching and potentially other impacts that it might be having. So obviously grass clover was something that you were going to be going for definite. But like, to be fair, like mentioning all the people that you mentioned there now, John Finn and Helen and Tommy, like what made you say that, okay, that we need to bring this into a systems trial like this? Like you said, this is kind of the final step before we go to market as such. Like,
when you look at the challenges around things like water quality and I suppose the needs to reduce our use levels of nitrogen fertilizer and build productivity in our systems, because we have to build up. Nationally we're using about 7.5 tons of grazed pasture per hectare. It has to lift from there. When you look at those challenges, you say you can't ignore anything in terms of possibilities to improve that. And like, there's nothing more important in a system than the quality of sward that you have, and attributes of that sward over the season. So, and when you look at those challenges, so you're right, we've measured nitrogen levels in our soils, we've measured water quality. We have a 10-year published data set of water quality at this site, showing that we can reduce nitrogen losses by good practices around using slurries better, targeted application of nutrient, soil fertility, all the basics, the good basics of grazing systems. But nonetheless, if you look at the targets that are being set out now in terms of water quality, we'll have to go further. We'll have to do better than we're doing at the moment. And in my mind, when you see those targets, in terms of the system, you can't ignore anything. And it's a bit like the fertility challenge of 10, 15 years ago for the farmer. It's not just going to be one single thing that solves that. It's not just going to be a simple solution. It'll probably be about building 3 or 4 or 5 different attributes into the system. So, building in clovers to reduce our reliance on chemical fertilizers, but also things like improving soil structure, building in, if there is potentially plants that might reduce the amount of nitrogen that's lost from the rooting zone of soils, better nutrient management planning, better genetics in terms of animals and so on. So if we're talking about reducing nutrient losses to water, for example, by 20 to 30%, which is the target that's set out there, I don't think we can ignore, what might seem relatively peripheral issues today. I think we'll have to build those things into our system in order to do it. So this is, a system that's built to incorporate, 4 or 5 different attributes to try and deliver the kinds of improvements in water quality while maintaining performance, productivity, profitability of the system. So that's why you're bringing something like multi-species grassland, or indeed including herbs in our grassland, into the kind of mainstream. It's to give us an extra 5 to 10% in terms of nitrogen savings, nitrogen retention in our systems. If you look to other countries, and I didn't mention the international data set, there's a huge body of international data, whether you look to mainland Europe, the US, New Zealand, looking at more diverse swards and potential impacts. Recently, I was in New Zealand, and they talk now very easily about, if you can have 10% plantain in your sward, that could correspond to as much as 6 to 8% reduction in terms of nitrate leaching beneath those soils. So like that's not you can't ignore that level of potential, and then build on top of that then in terms of your better fertilizer precision management, better grazing management, soil fertility and whatnot. That could, potentially accumulate to meet that target.
So yeah, by some relatively major but minor changes at the same time, we could potentially achieve what we're talking about achieving.
And it's not, look, I don't want to underestimate, it is a fundamental shift. I mean, we are trained, our dairy systems are based on uniformity, on high quality, just in time pasture available for dairy cows to get the best out of the system. And this is a challenge to try and integrate more species of grasses, different clover in itself, white clover, to integrate that into the system. We're going to have to make changes alone, not to mind talking about herbs and whatnot. But I think if the reward, if the end justifies the means, I think that's what we're saying. And I think the body of evidence that's there now from the different studies and the different agencies that have been working on this, I think it would be irresponsible of us not to be trying to include this in the system and see how we get on, so that farmers can see it for themselves.
Okay, so is the reduced leaching just linked to the deeper rooting type scenario, or what's behind it? Or
so there's a number of components to that. The first one is they tend to be lower dry matter contents in those. So on average, our more diverse sward, our multi-species sward, is about 2% lower dry matter over the season. So animals to eat the same are actually taking in more water. So there's a dilution impact in particular, we're focused on the urine patches, which have a high part of the nitrogen. The immediate nitrogen loss is from the urine patch on a free draining site. If you can increase the urine volume and dilute that nitrogen, that's an advantage. If you can, if you're reducing the nitrogen component in the diet by virtue of either slightly lower crude protein, that reduces the nitrogen lost in that urine patch. But there are other practices then as well. So it's not just dilution. You're also, it appears, and some studies are showing this now, you're increasing urination frequency. So you're spreading those urine patches out, maybe only by 5%, but that's nonetheless a massive N load that's being spread out by 5%, giving plants better opportunity to capture some of those nutrients. There seems to be some denitrification effects, both in the rumen and on the soils, that having herbs and in particular in the sward, plantain is the particular one in focus in New Zealand now. Having that in the sward reduces the amount of nitrogen that is in the urine patch, the concentration of the urine patch, and then some of that is denitrified quickly into benign nitrogen gas. So it's released into the air without any harmful effects. So there's a number of kind of pieces to the jigsaw, and there's a lot more work going on to try and break those down. But I mean, the idea is to get a component of that into the sward, and that will give us some benefits in terms of nitrate leaching, but also in terms of animal performance.
Okay, so mentioning the animal performance there now, you're approximately 2.5 years into the trial now at this stage. So first off, I suppose, explain the differences in the nitrogen regimes that you're using there, and then we might move into the animal performance to see, are you seeing any differences there?
Sure. So the nitrogen strategy is that your classic nitrogen 250 treatment is a unit a day over the season. So we in line with the regulations, we've delayed that first application. We're using more slurries at the beginning, but thereafter from April through to mid-September, it's a unit a day. So it's constantly applying nitrogen to those ryegrass swards to ensure that they have adequate N availability. The white clover then and the more diverse multi-species sward, they're getting similar nitrogen plan and slurry plan up to the 15th of April. So they're getting more or less the same nitrogen strategy up to that point. And then based on availability of clover in those swards, we are reducing and eliminating nitrogen from that for the months of May, June, July, and August, and coming back in with a small amount of N, maybe about 20 kilos in early September, to try and drive on those swards into the autumn. Just as we're extending rotation length and so on. So the difference is 250 versus 125 kilos of N, and primarily the difference is in the mid-season rather than in the shoulders of the season.
Okay.
All the swards, it's important to say, soil fertility levels at the site are really good, and that's really important whether it's clover or multi-species. So we're all index 3s for K, and we're actually low index 4s for P, even though we don't necessarily apply P at all. It's all protected urea fertilizer we use when we use it, but we do apply K, some in spring and some in autumn, just because we know how important it is for clovers and herbs in terms of rooting and so on. And we do apply sulfur. There is an application of ASN in April to try and, freeze draining soils. The evidence is fairly robust on that, and the importance of sulfur in early season to try and improve grassland productivity. But that's the fertilizer plan. In terms of animal performance then, like you say, we started the experiment in 2021. So we've 2 full lactations done now with animals on full-time multi-species versus full-time on grass clover versus full-time on ryegrass only. So the results are we're getting about an extra, so in comparison with the grass only treatment, with grass clover, we're getting about an extra 7-8 kilos of milk solids over the season, primarily in the second half of the season as the clover contents get over, into the high teens and low 20s in terms of contribution in the sward. We're getting a kick in terms of animal performance from there through to the end of the season. We're getting, so that's, I suppose, 465 kilos of milk solids, increasing to kind of 472, 473 kilos of milk solids. And then with the multi-species, we're getting about another 7-8 kilos of milk solids on top of that. And that seems to arise from, when we look at the last 2 years in lactations, it's coming from about early April on. And it's primarily a volume thing rather than the components. So the fat and protein contents aren't any higher, but we're getting leafy pastures with, it's primarily plantain now that's in these swards on top of the grasses and clovers. That's given us an extra incremental gain in terms of daily milk solids through milk yield from April right through to mid-season when the clovers kick in on the grass clover sward. So it's interesting. And that has been replicated internationally. I can see French data in UCD. I mean, we're seeing it in animal performance in sheep, in cattle, in young stock. So, I mean, there's a good body of evidence there now showing a potential to lift the performance of animals by having some of these herbs inside in our grazing swards.
Okay, so you said that it's predominantly plantain now at this stage, but and the other question actually I have here is you said about monoculture grass, like were they straight mixes all the time that you've been talking about there, or are they actually mixes of grass, if you know what I mean? So that was there a couple of, are you talking your Abergain, Aber-choice type mixes, or are you actually just talking about individual stands of grass?
You're talking about 2 high PPI, 1 diploid, 1 tetraploid ryegrass included in all swards actually. Okay. In the grass clover then we brought in different types of white clover. We had some smaller leaf, some medium leaf white clovers in the grass clover sward, and in the multi-species swards then you had the same high PPI ryegrasses. You had a small amount of Timothy and Meadowfescue as well were the other 2 grasses. You had red clover and a hybrid clover in there as well as the medium leaf white clovers. And then you had plantain and chicory. So I suppose the grass component of this was pretty much, we tried to keep the variability between varieties and stuff to a minimum. And I think that's important. I think in terms of, look, farmers and some farmers will always, at the same time as research is ongoing, they'll want to do some of this themselves, citizen scientists, and they want to do their own experiments, which is great. But I mean, what's on offer out there, I think we have to be careful that, if we're talking about using ryegrass in a multi-species sward, it has to be the best ryegrasses that we can use. We're not using, very early heading or, stuff that's not, we know it's not good quality, I guess, So it's the high PPI ryegrasses, proven medium leaf clovers in the main, and then in terms of the red clover and the herbs, then you're talking about, there isn't much variability, there isn't much options, I guess, in terms of what we have available in terms of herbs and so on at this stage. But it seems once you have the 3 functional groups, grasses, clovers, and herbs, there isn't a lot of evidence to say that having a lot of variety within those functional groups, having a lot of grasses, a lot of clovers, and a lot of herbs in there is any more beneficial than having the few important ones, I guess.
Okay, so a point that comes to my mind in relation to that, Brendan, is that Michael O'Donovan and Tomas Hubbard would often talk about not having anything that's less than 3 kilos in the mixes and really contributing from a grass point of view. So is that kind of staying the same? And I suppose the angle I'm coming at there is, we can see multi-species swards, bags of seed basically, that have an awful lot of everything inside in it, but not a very lot of anything in particular, if you know what I mean. So like, that's a concern from my perspective. I mean, what you're trying to do in the trial work that you're doing over at the moment is that you're looking at this. You're trying to be consistent in terms of the grass that's in each of those treatments, and then you want to see what's the influence of the clover and what's the influence of the herbs on top of the clover as well. But like, if people are getting bad quality grasses and they're getting a multitude of different herbs and clovers and all sorts inside in the bag, their experience could be poor in that scenario, could it?
It can be very different. So, and look, that's something to be wary of. I suppose at the outset of this, we put a group together of international experts, including John Finn in Johnstown, but other international experts, and said, listen, this is our rainfall pattern, this is our soil type. We want a highly productive grazing sward for animals, as well as trying to get the benefits of these other aspects. What should we have in this? And the response from that group was, keep it simple. So basic grasses, so high quality ryegrass, Timothy and Meadowfescue, they're a bit less normal in Irish grazing systems, but I mean, they're winter active, hardiness grasses that can grow under less tolerant conditions. The more dry summers and wetter winters we get, the more those will proliferate. The clovers are the clovers we have, so they're recommended list clovers for the main medium leaf, and then if the red clovers come in on top of that and whatnot, that's fine. And the herbs, there isn't much choice there, really, to be honest with you. But not. Why didn't we go beyond? I mean, there are some fantastic plants there: Sanswan, Bursfoot trefoil. There's all sorts of plants that we could include theoretically in that multi-species sward. But the group, on average, felt they won't establish or they won't be sustained in those swards. So even chicory, I mean, probably fails that test now, that it's a fantastic plant at the beginning of the sward. And it's very competitive, and that's important because we're not using post-emergent sprays and whatnot, but its lifetime in our swards is very short. So within 2 years, there's, one of the students is doing botanical compositions and quality evaluation of the various components, and I mean, they can't find chicory now in year 3. It's not possible to do that evaluation because we're physically not there. So that just tells you, I guess. I mean, for the most part, it's good quality grasses, medium leaf clovers, and then the fewest herbs that I suppose will contribute to that sward. So plantain and chicory in the main, I think. Yeah.
Okay, and just digging into the chicory a little bit more. So some reading that I've done on it would suggest maybe that is the loss of the chicory in the sward in your scenario, because we're trying to make the multi-species fit into our grazing blueprint, and that if there was a change to the management of it, that you might sustain it further. Now, I'm not questioning what you're doing in that sense, but I'm just asking, is that true in the suggestion that, like, if you were to go to a longer rotation, it might last longer, but then the trade-off is the quality that you might lose with going to the longer rotation?
Yeah, so there's two things there, and it's perfectly reasonable question. I'm asking it myself, so you're not asking anything I'm not thinking about. So number one, even in other countries and in other systems where they would have longer rotations, less frequent and less intensive grazing, chicory is a short-term crop. Yeah, I mean, even as a monoculture crop, it's not going to survive more than 2 years. So I think perhaps we're overstating the grazing practice impact on the persistency of it. That's my personal view. I mean, looking at New Zealand and other places, it just doesn't survive for long term. I'm not sure it would survive for long term, even in long rotation or lax grazing, let's call it, kind of settings, right? So that's the first thing around the chicory. But the second thing I think is, I mean, it is a very good, it's high mineral value. It's got lots of deep rooting characteristics and so on. As I say, its competition at the beginning is, for me, the most important attribute it has. So it's going to compete with any of those kind of, weeds that will come up in a new reseed, and you're not spraying. So, if you're putting in plantain, you're not spraying it, cannot spray it, so its tolerance is less to post-emergent sprays. So chicory in there makes good sense to me at that stage. I'm not sure what we can do. Like, I'm not sure to what extent we can extend the lifetime of chicory in our swards by grazing management. I think it's probably very limited. That'd be my own view. And look, we put huge emphasis and effort into getting clovers into swards and so on, and that has yielded benefit in terms of we've better clovers now than we had and whatnot. Perhaps there's a potential that we can extend that life expectancy of chicory in our swards in the future, but I suspect not. So I think then the longer term of that sward is you have to remember then what's going to be replacing that. And this is an issue that upsets farmers. I mean, they don't want something that's moving all the time, So the first year of a multi-species sward, you've got a dominance of chicory in the sward. It's very evident, very obvious. And year 2, it's less. And by year 3, it's largely gone. So what's replacing that then? Is that replaced by weeds? Is it replaced by just open ground, neither of which we'd be very happy with? But in our case, we haven't seen any increase in terms of weed proportion. There's no weed burden in those swards. So that's not the issue. The swards are more open, that's for sure. But then again, are you going to have clovers and herbs in swards that aren't open? I don't think, it is all about competition at the end of the day. And the other thing too is in terms of white clovers. I mean, white clovers are by their nature slow to establish at the beginning, and then they build in the sward over time. So it's probably 2.5 years before a farm goes from establishment of or sowing a new sward to having those high clover contents that we associate with our trials. So I think that's not a bad thing, that although the chicory moves out, everything else is largely stable for that first 3 years. The clovers are increasing. The red clover declines, the white clover takes over from the red clover. Plantain has been fairly steady. There are some seasonal changes, but pretty steady over that period. But again, its livelihood, after 3 to 4 years, it's unlikely that plantain will be long-term. The long-term of the sward, of an undisturbed grazing sward, is probably you're going to end up with grass clover in those swards. And that's all the more reason to have good grasses and good clovers there, that the long-term is supported. But I suppose even with that, in the first 4 years in a 10-year receding policy, you could still have 30-40% of the area contributing from herbs in the sward. And if there were benefits to that, I think we should be taking advantage of that in terms of, whether it's nitrogen saving. Some of the other things I didn't mention, biodiversity levels. We're measuring soil biodiversity levels. Unless we get results that are different to the international issue, we will see increases in below ground biodiversity to match the extra diversity that we have overground in terms of having these extra plants. So that's an extra issue. We're measuring methane at the moment. Ben Lart and Charlie Dwan are looking at the methane of the different swards. So no evidence on that at this stage. It'd be interesting to see how that works. So there might be other benefits, I guess, in the system that we'll have to see in the longer term.
Okay, so I suppose we're close to wrapping up now, but we've a lot of research done on ryegrass. Obviously, we've breeding programs there for ryegrass in an Irish context in particular. We have a lot of expertise in that area, I suppose. But what about the likes of the plantain and the chicory? Like, there's obviously an emphasis in the clover now again. Is there going to be an emphasis put onto breeding better plantain and chicory and the like?
Yeah, so we are looking at, our breeding programs now to incorporate more herbs, to look at plantain in particular, I guess, is the main one. That we look at is how much diversity is there and what could that differ. There is, even some kind of a component work that's done there looking at different varieties. They're not all the same. So, that's important. And that's something, and I suppose here in Moorepark now, Thomas Tubbard has a grass clover plantain sward, and that's going to be very interesting in terms of what that yields over the next 4 to 5 years in terms of performance and that. So I suppose, look, it's, for some perhaps it's frustratingly slow, the pace of change in terms of that, but you're trying to hedge your bets all the time and invest money wisely in terms of resources and that. So yes, we will be doing work in terms of Pat Connaughton's already had conversations, and he's already looking at, in addition to the red clovers now, he's also looking at the herbs, the plantain in particular, in terms of what he might be able to do there around breeding and so on. So I think that'll happen in and of itself over the next few years.
Okay, and I asked you about the plantain and the chicory, but are there breeding programs around the Timothy and the Metafescue going to develop as well, potentially?
Well, not at this stage, but I guess that's something that'll be over time. You have to, it is a long-term investment in terms of breeding plants. How long does it take, if you start tomorrow? So not at this stage, but I think for the most part, the grasses will still be fairly based on high PPI ryegrasses. So that's still going to be the mainstay of those swards anyway. So Timothy is interesting. Timothy is a high growth plant. It grows 20 tons under plot trials. Very good winter activity. If you think of, I guess, in principle, you think about that grass clover sward and the clover content declining between autumn and spring. Having a grass in there that's more active, it'll take up some of the space. Seems, it's a good idea, I think, So, but look, we'll have to do more. We are measuring the quality of Timothy in our swards to see what it is like through mid-season. That's probably its biggest weakness, that its mid-season quality wouldn't be anything like as good as ryegrass. But nonetheless, I mean, you're hoping at that stage you'll have, 15, at this stage in the year now, we should have 15 to 20% clover in our swards. And that will offset any reduction in quality by having a small component of Timothy in the sward,
People are doing a bit of reseeding at the moment. There's going to be more reseeding, hopefully done over the course of the year. The scheme is obviously there to promote it, so it will drive it to a certain extent. What's your thinking behind people dipping the toe in? You said about the early adopters, but should more people be looking at it?
I'd encourage farmers to look at it for themselves, because I think just like clover, we have to learn to farm this for ourselves and on our own farms in our own specific environment, I guess. So I'm a fan of farmers learning to do this and integrate it into the system. I suppose the one issue that comes up for a farmer doing it over and above a research experiment doing it is, you have to remember in the farm you're probably doing maybe 5 to 10% of the area in any one year. And then animals have to adapt to that, and people have to adapt to that animals going into it, they are creatures of habit, and what's this you're asking me to graze kind of thing, happens. So there's a bit of that at the start, in particular when the chicory is so abundant in the sward. So it's so different. So I think there's a bit of learning around managing it around pre-grazing and herbage mass and quality and so on. So just to be mindful of that, but I'd be encouraging farmers as much as possible to look at incorporating a multi-species sward on their farm and look at it for themselves in their own environment. I mean, the evidence is performance of animals, if anything, is improved. There's no loss in dry matter production or quality. It's going to contribute on a lot of the fronts that I mentioned at the beginning, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of potential savings in water quality, in terms of carbon storage. We didn't mention that one. I mean, there is lots of evidence there that we will store more carbon in our soils by having deeper rooting grasses and other species in there. So, I mean, they're all things that probably tomorrow we're not going to be able to say we got the benefit of. But over time, I think you'd have to say, as a sensible long-term strategy for Irish dairy farmers, not to be too over-reliant on a monoculture of ryegrass, given all the things we talked about. Putting more clovers in and putting more herbs into our swards, I think, is a sensible way. I think it's a way to go. I'd encourage it.
Okay, so we'll wrap it up with that, Brendan. So thanks very much for giving us an update on the trial and giving us your insights into the multi-species. And I suppose it's definitely something that people should maybe try a little bit of, just to see how they find it. And it's going to be an interesting journey for everybody. And you're obviously in year 2 at the moment. Of how long is the plan for the entire trial in the short term, we'll say, in the current trial that you're on at the minute?
Yeah, we've 2 completed years. We're in year 3, and we will run for 5 years. Just based on some of the environmental measurements, they take longer to get the benefits of those, and maybe longer thereafter. We'll have to see at that point then where we are.
Okay, thanks very much, Brendan.
Welcome.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Age podcast, and my thanks to Brendan Horan for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Stuart Childs, and join me next time for your Dairy Age.